Mexico has not blocked U.S. trade, but what has unfolded in 2025 is a high-stakes economic confrontation between two of the world's largest integrated trading partners, the United States and Mexico, where tariff threats, political pressure, and strategic brinkmanship could destabilize supply chains worth nearly $1 trillion annually, with cascading effects that reach every factory floor in Detroit, every grocery shelf in Dallas, and every energy market from Houston to Mexico City. U.S. tariff proposals targeting Mexican imports, proposed levies on automobiles as high as 30%, and threats of punitive measures on steel, aluminum, and key intermediate goods have not only sparked diplomatic pushback from Mexican leadership, but also triggered alarm across global markets that depend on the world's most complex North American industrial ecosystem. Here, where parts cross the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times during manufacture, blanket tariffs are not abstract numbers. They are potential catalysts for factory shutdowns, price hikes for consumers, and realignment of multinational investment strategies that could reshape the economic landscape of the Western Hemisphere. When you consider that over 75% of Mexico's exports flow to the United States, and that U.S.-Mexico bilateral trade in goods recently approached $840 billion annually, the stakes could not be higher. This is not a speculative scenario. This is an economic pressure cooker with potential geopolitical consequences. Before we continue into the operational realities, the strategic implications, and the broader global resonance of these trade tensions, if you are following this story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the developments in U.S.-Mexico trade policy are dynamic, consequential, and will affect industries, investments, and jobs on both sides of the border. At the heart of this confrontation is the integrated nature of the North American supply chain. Automotive manufacturing alone illustrates the complexity. A single modern vehicle assembled in the United States contains components from dozens of factories in Mexico and vice versa. Engines, transmissions, electronic control modules, wiring harnesses, suspension units, and safety systems often cross the border 2, 3, or 4 times during the assembly process. Under current law, for vehicles to qualify for tariff-sensitive treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, a certain percentage of the value must originate within the 3 countries. Disruptions to this finely tuned logistical choreography, whether through tariffs, customs delays, or regulatory uncertainty, would cascade through manufacturing clusters in the Great Lakes region, the Southeast, and Central Mexico, threatening production schedules and forcing corporations to consider relocating plants outside the continent entirely. When economists talk about productivity, they rarely emphasize that modern manufacturing presupposes seamless cross-border flows. Here, those flows are now in jeopardy. The negotiations that unfolded in 2025 were born not from a single event, but from accumulated political pressure within the United States to address long-standing concerns over trade deficits, labor standards, and immigration entanglements. The Trump administration's strategy linked tariff threats on Mexican goods with demands for increased border enforcement and cooperation on curbing illicit cross-border flows, such as fentanyl precursors. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and her economic team responded with diplomatic firmness, emphasizing Mexico's role as a responsible trading partner and rejecting the notion that reciprocal trade obligations could be held hostage to unrelated policy disputes. What Mexico did secure through sustained negotiation was a 90-day extension that avoided the immediate imposition of the harsher 30% tariff on a broad swath of goods. This extension was not a capitulation. It was a strategic pause that underscored Mexico's leverage within the USMCA framework and the mutual dependency of both nations' economies. Economists and trade analysts have warned that even the threat of tariffs can destabilize markets. Financial institutions tracking cross-border capital flows noted immediate volatility in automotive supplier stocks and currency markets following tariff announcements. The Mexican peso experienced sharp fluctuations against the U.S. dollar, reflecting investor anxiety about future export volumes and capital repatriation. Commodity prices that feed into manufactured goods, from steel and copper to plastics and agricultural inputs, also reacted as markets digested increased risk premiums. These reactions underscore a fundamental truth about modern globalized trade. Anticipation of policy risk can be as disruptive as policy implementation itself. Industry responses have been swift and unequivocal. Major automakers with assembly plants in both countries issued statements urging calm, emphasizing that tariff unpredictability could force supply chain redesigns costing billions of dollars and potentially resulting in job cuts. Tier 1 suppliers, many of whom operate on razor-thin margins due to just-in-time inventory practices, warned that they could not absorb sudden cost increases without passing them on to original equipment manufacturers or consumers. Meanwhile, agricultural groups in states such as California, Arizona, and Texas, which export billions of dollars in produce to Mexico annually, raised alarms about retaliatory measures that could hit their markets in direct response to U.S. tariffs. The interconnectedness of these sectors means that a shock in one part of the economy reverberates widely, threatening everything from employment to pension funds that hold stocks in these industries. At a strategic level, U.S. and Mexican policymakers are navigating competing domestic imperatives. In the United States, political leaders face intense pressure from constituencies that believe long-standing trade agreements have failed to protect American workers, and that assertive tariff measures could rebalance manufacturing employment. Figures like Senator Bernie Sanders, historically critical of expansive free trade frameworks, have lent nuanced commentary, supportive of protecting labor and environmental standards, yet skeptical of blanket tariffs that risk inflating consumer prices and inviting global retaliation. Sanders' critique centers on the idea that trade policy should strengthen domestic industries through enforceable standards and worker protections, not through unpredictable tariff spikes that act like blunt instruments. This duality reflects a broader ideological conflict in U.S. economic policy, between opening markets with rules and closing them with barriers. Mexican leadership, for its part, must balance national economic interests with domestic political realities. A significant portion of Mexico's industrial output depends on stable access to the U.S. market. Yet, public opinion in Mexico has grown wary of what is perceived as extrinsic political leverage being applied to economic relations. In response, Mexico's government has accelerated diversification efforts, seeking deeper ties with European and Asian markets. This strategy includes negotiating expanded trade agreements with partners in the European Union, Japan, and the Pacific Alliance, efforts that, if successful, could reduce Mexico's reliance on the U.S. market over the long term while retaining near-term economic stability. Global investors are watching these developments closely. Capital inflows into Mexico's industrial and manufacturing sectors slowed after tariff threats intensified, even as currency hedges and risk-averse strategies increased. U.S. markets saw similar patterns in sectors directly tied to bilateral trade. This synchronization of economic signals reflects a critical reality. North American trade policy is not a bilateral transaction contained at the border. It is integrated into global capital flows, commodity markets, and investor expectations. Disruptions here can ripple into currency markets in Asia, equities in Europe, and bond markets worldwide. Another strategic dimension lies in legal frameworks. The USMCA contains enforced dispute settlement mechanisms that provide structured pathways for resolving conflicts without resorting to unilateral punitive measures. Legal scholars emphasize that engaging these channels offers a more predictable and rules-based approach to trade disagreements than broad tariffs, which can contravene World Trade Organization (WTO) norms. If the Trump administration or future U.S. policymakers pursue tariffs outside these mechanisms, both Mexico and Canada, the other USMCA partner, could invoke countermeasures or bring the dispute to international adjudication. Such proceedings take time, often years, and create prolonged periods of uncertainty that are anathema to stable investment climates. On the ground, manufacturing workers and small business owners feel the tension in very concrete ways. Factory managers report increased difficulty planning production schedules due to unpredictable material costs. Logistics companies, whose operations depend on cross-border trucking and rail synchronization, face mounting compliance costs and potential inspection slowdowns that could add critical hours to delivery times. Retailers warn that tariffs on Mexican imports, especially in textiles, appliances, and food products, would inevitably be passed on to consumers. For lower-income households already stressed by inflationary pressures, these cost increases could erode purchasing power and dampen economic growth. Political leaders in both capitals are acutely aware of these pressures. Public opinion polls in the United States show a deeply divided electorate. Some segments strongly support assertive trade enforcement as a means to protect domestic jobs, while others fear that such measures will increase consumer costs and harm export-oriented industries. In Mexico, public sentiment reflects a blend of national pride in economic sovereignty and pragmatic concern over job security in export-dependent regions, particularly in industrial hubs like Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Querétaro. As we look ahead, the future of U.S. Mexico trade relations is laden with uncertainty. Temporary tariff extensions have bought time, but not resolution. Negotiations will continue, and the contours of any long-term settlement remain undefined. What analysts agree on is that both economies are too interlinked for a complete severing of trade flows without catastrophic economic pain. It is not just cars or produce at risk. Financial services, energy trade, and even cross-border legal cooperation could be affected by deeper ruptures in the bilateral relationship. In the broader geopolitical context, other global powers are watching closely. China, the European Union, and countries in Southeast Asia see openings to strengthen ties with Mexico and the United States alike if trade instability persists. China, in particular, may accelerate overtures to Mexican industries seeking alternative markets, while European investors could capitalize on uncertainty to expand their footprint in Latin America. These external forces add layers of complexity to a bilateral dispute that might otherwise be contained within North America. The core truth of this unfolding situation is that economic policy cannot be disentangled from political strategy, domestic pressures, and global competitive dynamics. Every tariff threat, every negotiation delay, every investor reaction feeds into a broader narrative of economic realignment in the 21st century. The outcomes of these U.S. Mexico tensions will not simply be measured in trade balances, but in how they reshape industrial footprints, labor markets, and geopolitical alliances. Ultimately, the consequence of these trade frictions, whether they are resolved through diplomacy, escalate into formal trade actions, or remain in a state of protracted uncertainty, will reverberate far beyond the immediate headlines. The economic architecture of North America, once lauded as a model of regional integration, now faces a test of resilience. What remains unclear is not whether these tensions matter, they do, but how deeply they will alter the economic and strategic landscape of the continent and the world.